Welcome to PCC 240M, managing a Windows Server environment. My name is Robert McMillen, and I'm going to be bringing you some lectures on 240M, and we're going to discuss all about how to introduce Microsoft Active Directory to you, build your first domain controllers, join a client to a domain, and explain what all that means. So let's take a look at what Chapter 1 and 2 brings us. We're going to be identifying key features of various different versions of Windows, as well as understanding important features of Server 2016 and exploring all different types of concepts. So let's start with Windows Server 2016 editions. So we've got lots of different versions of 2016, but strangely enough, it's less than it was back in the 2008 days. 2016 comes in the Essentials, the Standard, and the Datacenter version. And that's for typical business types of use. But there's also some other versions as well. There's the multi-point premium server, storage server, and Hyper-V server as well. So let's first take a look at the Essentials edition. So the Essentials edition is going to support up to 25 users. So this is for a fairly small location. 16.8 million connections. Of course, no one's going to be doing that. 2 central processor sockets. So you can have up to 2 physical sockets in there, but you can, of course, have many cores on those sockets. You can have up to 50 remote desktop connections and 50 VPN connections using routing and remote access. So this edition cannot join a domain other than to migrate files and data from one server to another. So it can be a domain controller, but it cannot join some other domain. Provides most but not all server roles, does not provide a role for hosting virtual machines, and cannot provide cloud services. The Standard Edition, which is the one we'll be using in our course, is the one that's going to be the most popular out there in businesses today. And it has a lot of different services that you would come to expect, such as file and print, internet connectivity, management of users, and centralized management of applications. So there's a lot of new features in 2016, such as the Start button is back. Everybody's excited about that. It looks very much like Windows 10. Domain controller can be cloned. That's a new feature. Generic routing encapsulation to enable VPNs to go over external networks. Very cool. Desired state configuration used to monitor specific server states and roles. So we've got some other ones, such as Windows Defender is automatically included as an antivirus and anti-malware program, although most people, I'm sure, will replace it with a third-party paid version. Storage tiering allows selected blocks of data to be moved to different storage locations. So storage tiering we'll talk about a little bit later on in the course, but basically it has to do with the ability to have faster hard drives and slower hard drives and deciding where that data goes. Storage pinning with storage tiering enables you to move specific files to a desired type of storage, same type of thing. A new network controller that provides information about the network structure, parallel rebuild, and virtual desktops. Enables you to run different desktops side by side. So virtual desktops are going to be a very big thing. They're already kind of a big thing in businesses. Windows is a little late to this game. Companies like IBM, Cisco, and other ones came out with their own versions of the virtual desktops. But now that Windows has theirs, we should definitely learn about it because it is coming on strong. So some things included in Windows Server 2016, Hyper-V, which was not included in the Essentials version. You can also, with Hyper-V, you can clone virtual machines, which makes things go a little faster. Migration of individual VMs. VM information is stored in a new file format, and that protects the information from being edited, so that way viruses cannot affect it quite as much. And we also have something called containers. Now, we're not really going to be dealing with containers, but basically it's sort of the virtual machines of applications. You can create a virtual application that runs in its own memory space. So we won't be handling that in this particular course, but you should be aware of what it is. So Windows Server 2016 Datacenter, it's really designed for higher end types of locations, larger locations, data centers themselves, of course. Mission critical applications, huge databases, large virtualization requirements, cloud computing, and information access requiring high availability using clustering. Although you can do clustering with the standard version, there are some additional features in the data center version. So the differences between the two, virtualization. So with virtualization in data center, you can put as many virtual machines into Hyper-V as you want, and it doesn't cost anything extra. With the standard edition, you can also put as many virtual machines as you want, except you only get 2 that come with the operating system, rather than an unlimited amount. And this also brings up an interesting problem with VMware. So VMware is also another virtual type of software, just like VirtualBox. VirtualBox, of course, is free. VMware has a free option as well, but most everybody ends up with the paid one because it's the only one that really does anything good for businesses. But VMware, if you go and you pay for the support, pay for the high-end products, and you buy Windows servers, you don't get any free virtual machines with it. So this option with Windows, that they give you these free virtual machines with the operating system, has cut a huge dent into VMware's business. So I'm not seeing a lot of new VMware implementations. I'm seeing many that are already out there that are being kept up, but new implementations are generally being used with Hyper-V. So you may want to keep that in mind as you go through your training, that Windows Hyper-V is definitely on the way up and VMware is on the way down. Multi-point services. So I mentioned that as a version in the Windows service options. Enables many users to share the same physical computer through each person connecting a keyboard, monitor, and mouse. So it's very much like a terminal server, but it's being typically used by schools and nonprofits. So it's a lower cost option. OEMs. So this is the old way of buying software, where you'd go into a store, you'd buy a computer, and you would get an original equipment manufacturer's license on that computer. So not many people do that quite as much anymore when it comes to businesses. Of course, individuals may still do that or buy the computers online. And it comes with an OEM license on there. Now, you can't move an OEM license from one location to another. You know, when you go to replace the motherboard, Microsoft says, nope, time for a new license, because the OEM license is much cheaper than the retail copy, where you can move them from one to another. Storage server 2016 turns a server into a central storage center for data. So basically it turns it into an iSCSI target. So if you've heard of a SAN, storage area network, that connects using an iSCSI connection with Ethernet, then you have heard of what Windows Storage Server does. So basically it allows you to use, for a much lower cost, a Windows license where you load up a server with a whole bunch of hard drives on it, and then you use that storage onto another server running a higher end license like Windows Standard or Datacenter. So on that higher end licensed server, you connect to the storage and you can map it as the D drive, the E drive, the F drive, whatever it is, but that storage is actually coming from this other server. So it's a very nice feature. It's a less expensive option than going with a storage area network, which typically can cost $20,000 on up. With this option, you could do it for maybe a few hundred or a few $1,000s. Microsoft Hyper-V server. It's a free download. It's a basic server. It enables you to use Hyper-V. So it doesn't really do anything else other than run Hyper-V server. It doesn't give you any free virtual machines or anything like that, but it is a base operating system that where you can load up a whole bunch of other virtual machines onto it. And those, of course, you would pay for. So you can use this to learn how Hyper-V works. It's very nice. All right, we'll be installing in our course a client operating system, and it'll be Windows 10. And this Windows 10 will be joined to our Active Directory domain, which we'll talk about in a little bit. So Server 2016 supports a lot of different operating systems that can connect to it as a domain client, but the best versions are at a minimum Windows 7, 8, 8.1, and 10. So Windows 10 being the most compatible as far as being able to manage the client. So a client is a computer that accesses resources on another computer via the network. So Windows 10 would be a client to your Windows Server 2016 Active Directory domain controller. A workstation is a computer that has its own CPU and can be used as a standalone or network computer. So a client can be virtual or physical, but a workstation is physical. And it has its own CPU, as I mentioned before. Overall goal of Microsoft is to achieve a lower total cost of ownership. Yeah. So TCO is the full cost of owning a network, including hardware, et cetera, et cetera. Although they say they want to make this as cheap as possible, of course, they also want you to spend as much as possible with them. So Microsoft is mainly a software company, so they're going to make it as easy as possible to have you buy as many licenses as possible to run on as little hardware as possible. And so it's good for them, not so great for the hardware manufacturers, but it's good for the consumer as well, because you end up spending overall less money, assuming that the software works as it should. A domain is a grouping of network objects such as computers, servers, and user accounts that provides for easier management. So we're going to be talking a lot about domains because we're going to be creating one of our own, a domain and a forest. One of the things that we can install on our Windows Server 2016 that we'll be doing in an upcoming course is Microsoft IIS. So basically that is a web server. And it has a lot of different modules that come with it. You can install FTP, you can install WebDev, you can install various different types of web pages, ASP, CGI, .NET, all these different things. So it is a full-featured web server. Some people like to use the Linux web servers. They there's far more Linux websites out there than there are Windows. But that's just because you can get Linux, of course, for free. But the Microsoft web server is very good. I've used it for many years, all the way back to NT4. Windows Server Core is another version of Windows. It is a minimum server configuration designed to function very similar to Unix and Linux servers. So you don't have a GUI. It does not provide that. It has a command line. There are some graphical tools, extra services that you don't need. They're taken off. Mouse pointer on the screen is not there. Windows Mail, Word, all that kind of stuff, don't have it. So it's basically so you can use very little hardware but still run Windows, or an older piece of hardware, an older server where you can still run Windows. And you just load up through PowerShell any roles and features that you want that it supports. And Windows Nano Server is even smaller than Server Core as far as its footprint. It is a very basic server, and it's inexpensive as well. And you use Nano Server as like an application or a single type of feature that you want to install on a server. So if you want to do just one thing, such as a web server, perfect example of Nano, you can load it up in a very low-end or older piece of hardware, and you install the role for web server, and you make it a web server, and that's all it does. So you can harden that thing. You can put it on a very small footprint type of computer. PowerShell, as I mentioned, PowerShell is something that you can use to install roles and features. It's a command line. It's just like what the old command prompt looked like, except for it has a little PS next to where the C drive is or whatever drive you're on, and so that way you know you're in PowerShell. And PowerShell, as you can see here, does a lot of different things. So you can think of PowerShell as a batch file type of a thing. So when you create a batch file, you're taking a whole bunch of different commands and save them into a special text file where you can run them. Well, PowerShell is very much like that. You're taking a whole bunch of different executables and DLL files and INF files, putting them all together in a script, calling it a PowerShell script, and when you run it, it does a whole bunch of things at once. And so that's really all it is it's a fancy type of batch file, but it allows you to do so much more than a batch file could ever do. So you can basically run the entire server using PowerShell, never have to use a graphical user interface again if you didn't want to. You can perform a lot of different tasks, as you see here, managing web servers, lock a computer or log off. You can even manage other servers from PowerShell as well. You can manage a whole bunch of different things. And we use commandlets, is what they call CMD-LETS, as you see the last word on the slide. Commandlets is what we use, which are basically these scripts that run. So if we take a look at our screen, this shows a black and white version, but you'll probably see a blue and white version when you open up PowerShell on your computer. And this is available on Windows 10 as well as Server 2016. So you can see PowerShell is at the top. You can see it's running PowerShell, and you can see a command was run called getChildItem, and it shows all that information. So that's just one of the many different PowerShell commands, and there are tens of thousands of PowerShell commands and switches and options. And they come up with new ones every day. One of the frustrating things about PowerShell is the same command that ran in 2008 no longer works in 2012, and the same one in 2012 no longer runs in 2016. So Microsoft constantly changes the same commands and switches to do the same thing. They just change, what the syntax is. Not sure why they do that. It's super frustrating. But if you come across a PowerShell command and it doesn't say that it works for 2016, it may not. So just keep that in mind. Hyper-V is the virtual machine software product that comes with Windows Server. We're, of course, using VirtualBox. So why are we using VirtualBox instead of Hyper-V? Well, VirtualBox works with all the ADA compliance that we need it to work with. So it gives everybody a chance to learn. Whereas Hyper-V does not have all those capabilities, so we're using VirtualBox for that. VirtualBox also runs on every platform. It'll run on Macintosh, it'll run on Linux, and I do have a lot of students that decide they want to run on something other than Microsoft Windows as a client. And that's perfectly fine. You can use VirtualBox on any one of those, whereas Hyper-V will only run on Windows. So Hyper-V has a lot of capabilities, including clustering, can be used with Windows and Linux operating systems. You can actually load a Linux operating system as a virtual machine on Hyper-V, but you can't run Hyper-V on a Linux operating system. Compatible with different types of storage, enables fast migration from one computer to another, that's absolutely true, and can house 64-bit and 32-bit operating systems. So it is very good. You can even run 16-bit and 8-bit operating systems if you do it right. But who would want to do that except for fun? IP address format. So we're going to be doing a lot of IP addressing in our first lab. And we're going to be using IPv4, which is a 32-bit addressing, which is the most well-known at this time. And there's an example of an IPv4 address. And we'll be setting static IP addresses for our first lab. Unicast, that's a one-to-one type of a packet. So basically, when your Windows 10 computer wants to communicate with your Windows server, that's a unicast packet being sent back and forth. Whereas multicast is a little bit different. That's where a server is able to treat all clients as a group and send one packet per transmission that reaches all clients. So a great example of this is video. So if I'm on a server serving up a video where I want a lot of people to see it all at once, I will use multicast. I'll broadcast out the packet to everybody, and whoever receives it, receives it. If they don't receive it, they don't see it. So something to keep in mind. You'll be hearing a lot about unicast and multicast in test quizzes and certifications as well. Broadcast sends a communication to all points on a specific network. Very similar to multicast, except for multicast is targeted to, it can be targeted to many different subnets. Whereas broadcast sends all points to a specific network, which is, your own network that you're on, for instance. So why do we need broadcast? Well, the first time a client goes to connect to another client or a server, it doesn't know where it is. So it sends off a broadcast packet and says, hey, where is this server? And then the server responds and says, hey, I'm here. Well, that information is recorded in the network switch that you're connected through. And then the next time you go to connect to that server, you no longer have to broadcast to it. The switch itself will just direct you right there because it caches that information. So broadcast is very important for finding resources. Subnet masks. This shows the class of addressing used, and it divides the network into subnets and hosts. So those of you who have taken Datacom, you are already aware of how this works. But basically a subnet mask will say, okay, on the left-hand side, we've got this many networks, and on the right-hand side, we've got this many hosts. And as we change the subnet mask, it changes how many networks and hosts that you have. Ultimately, you're always going to have around 4 billion addresses, because that's what 2 to the 32nd power is. But you can divide, using the subnet mask, is how many hosts you have if you need a lot of computers to connect to the network, or a lot of networks, which is you're dividing up the the business into a whole bunch of different segments. And there's lots of different reasons to do that we're not covering in this course, but you should be aware of what a subnet mask does. IP address considerations. Anytime you see a 127.0.0.0 type of a network address, that's called the loopback address. So sometimes if we're troubleshooting, trying to see whether or not a a card is working properly, we'll ping 127.0.0.1. If we get a response, then we know the physical card itself is working. No one can use private IP addresses on the internet, so there is a certain amount of private IP addresses out there. And you'll probably have learned about that again, once again, at Datacom. We'll be using the 192.168.0 and .1 subnets in this course. So this course and the upcoming courses as well. So this is part of a 3-course setup where 240M starts it, and then 288M and 289M complete it. You can take those other two in any order you want. So IP version 6 is something that we don't use in this course, but there are other courses that use it, and it allows for 128-bit address capability. So if you recall, IPv4 is 32-bit and IPv6 is 128-bit. Well, you can imagine how many more addresses that you're going to have. So we've run out of the 4 billion addresses already out on the internet. There are no new ones, new IP subnets that are being leased out there, from ICANN are going through IP version 6 instead. So we can still use IP version 4 internally because of natting, which again you learn in Datacom. We'll talk a little bit about that more in this course. But any new public IP addresses out there are all going to be IP version 6. Now the good news about IP version 6 is because it's 128 bits, it basically allows for up to 80 trillion IP addresses per person on the planet. So we have more than enough to go around. There's also built-in security as well, which helps against hacking a little bit. Static and dynamic addressing. When you first plug a network cable into your computer, by default it's going to be set up for dynamic addressing, which means it's going to go out and look for a server to hand it an IP address. But in our course, because we're using domain controllers and we want them to communicate specifically internally with a client, we're going to be using static addressing. So you're going to be manually assigning your IP addresses. We're also setting up what's called a DNS server, which is a name resolution server. So when your client looks for DC01, it needs to have a name that resolves to an IP address. So the computers use IP addresses, we use names. So you need something to translate the names to the IP addresses for you, and that's what DNS does. So DNS is automatically part of your first domain controller. It will automatically install DNS on there, and it will help you resolve the names as you go from one computer to another. NetBIOS is for older types of operating systems, but it's still out there. So NetBIOS names, that will make sense when you go through the domain controller upgrade process. There's also something called Dynamic Domain Name System. It enables client computers to automatically register their IP addresses in DNS without intervention. So when my computer joins the domain and it has a dynamic IP address from a DHCP server, then it's going to dynamically update the DNS server. It's going to say, hey, here's my computer name and here's my computer address. So that's dynamic DNS. And that way you don't have to go in and manually tell the DNS server where your computer name and IP address are. Some other interesting things about TCP/IP: address resolution protocol used to acquire physical addresses associated with the computer network interface card. So if you want to go and do a reverse lookup, so basically a forward lookup is when you ping DC01 and you get an IP address. But what if you want to say, hey, where is the reverse of that? What if I ping an IP address, I want to get a name? You can do that. Excuse me. But sometimes when you ping, the firewall will block it. So you're like, wow, what do I do now? How do I know if this computer is even alive? You'd use the ARP command. So you type ARP space -A, and then you hit enter, and it'll tell you all the other IP addresses it sees on the network. So it can tell you whether something is alive or not. Every NIC has a physical address, which we call a media access control address. And this is a burned-in address by the manufacturer. This address is not the same as a TCP/IP address. The TCP/IP is a logical address, meaning you can change that IP address over and over to different ones. The media access control address you cannot change. It is burned into that network card. Now, there is some software that can allow you to mask what it is, but you're not going to change the physical one. We need to create disk partitions when we go through the installation of the operating system. And this is a process where a hard disk is section or a complete hard drive is prepared for use by the operating system. So we're going to be partitioning the drive, we're going to be formatting the drive, and then we will be installing the operating system. And all this stuff will happen just by clicking the next button when you go through this. So here's an example of the when you want to install Windows, it sees this very large unallocated hard drive. And now you could format it if you wanted to, but instead, if you just click next, it'll do it for you. However, if you have a format on there from a different operating system, such as, let's say you have a Linux partition on here, well, and you decide to repurpose it for Windows. Well, if you try to hit next, it'll error out. So what you have to do is you have to delete the partition, click the delete button, and then you have to click the format button, and then you can go ahead and click next. So if you have other operating systems, like I said, already on that disk, then you need to do some additional things. Now, after the installation is complete, you're going to see this. You're going to see this cool Server Manager. Server Manager is the place where all the hard work is done. So you can access basically anything that you need to manage your server and Active Directory from Server Manager. So in Server Manager, we've got one of the sections is disks, since we're talking about partitioning. And you can see there is a disk with 932 gigabytes on it. And it's using a master boot record, which is MBR, which we'll talk about later on. And you can see at the bottom it says a C and a D drive. So 2012 can be upgraded to Server 2016 if you're upgrading from a compatible version to a compatible edition. So you're not going to go from, say, the Essentials version to the Datacenter version. It's just not going to happen. So you can go standard to standard or Datacenter edition. When you upgrade to 2016, use a full version of the new OS and not a special upgrade version. So there's no longer an upgrade operating system like there used to be in previous versions of Windows. You're installing the full version. Planning user and device licensing. Well, there's lots of different licenses that you need. There's a server license that you buy when you buy the operating system for the server, and a client license when you buy the Windows 10 client. However, you also need a client access license to access the server from the client. So let's say you have 100 Windows 10 PCs that are connecting to your 2016 server. Well, you need to buy 100 client access licenses for that. Now, they're not super expensive. They're about $50 a piece, but they are one additional fee that you need to get. Let's see, you have to choose a computer name, of course, and you want to make sure that you don't choose a computer name that is named after a person at a company, because people leave at companies, and it's much better to call it by position. So is it the accounting computer, the receptionist computer, etc., like that. So here's some of the different naming convention restrictions that you have here: maximum length, shorter names, etc., etc. Primary installation method of Windows Server 2016 is DVD or thumb drive. We're going to be using, most likely, you'll be using the DVD, but you can also download the ISO file from DreamSpark, which I believe has been renamed, or you can get the free 180-day trial version, which lasts longer than the class. And I recommend using that because with DreamSpark, you only get a certain amount of licenses, and you probably have more classes than licenses. So you can just Google Windows Server 2016 or Windows 10 demo version, and you'll get the 180-day license, which you can actually reuse over and over if you use a certain command, which we can talk about in an upcoming video. So you can use the DVD, you can download the ISO, you can upgrade. Installation for a virtual server, you can use Hyper-V and Windows Deployment Services. We're not going to be using Windows Deployment Services in this course, but that allows you to push out an operating system from the server to the client or another server, and it uses the PXE, pre-execution environment technology. So to start from a DVD, which many of you will be doing, make sure the BIOS is set to boot first from the optical drive, or just press F12. You can press F12 typically in most computers, and it'll pop up the menu option. You'll boot from the DVD, and then you'll follow the prompts to install. If you're upgrading from 2012, then you would do that inside Windows itself, and it will reboot and start the installation process. After the server is installed, you need to activate the server. So in order to activate it, you type in the command. It'll automatically activate itself in the background, but if it doesn't because of some error, then you need to run a couple of troubleshooting tools to do that. And here's where you can enter a product key. So if you entered one key and you decide you want to change that key, then you can certainly go and do that as well. So for instance, if you got a demo version and you wanted to make it a permanent one, then you would open up this product key option. All right, there's service packs. So Windows comes with a lot of bugs on it. There was one study done at Windows 2000 many years ago, and it said it came with 64,000 bugs on it when it was released by Microsoft. It was not a very good release for them. So they decided to fix many of those bugs using service packs. And after the second service packs, they got it down to about 4,000 bugs. So good for them. So you're going to have hopefully not as bad a time, but you're going to have similar issues with Windows Server 2016 and Windows 10. They come with bugs. So you need to have service packs installed. Now with Windows 10, updates happen automatically. 2016, they don't. So you can go in and say when it is that you want your updates to happen. But you definitely want to install those. But you can do it in a controlled environment. Make sure you have a backup of the server ahead of time, just in case the update breaks it. All right, so that is going to cover our first module. You can now go ahead and get started in your labs. Now keep in mind, in the labs, you're also going to see mini videos. So one of the reasons why this lecture is so short, and some of you may think it's not, but the lecture is so short is because we've decided to put in short videos that are interspersed throughout the labs themselves. So if you need to learn how to do something, you watch a 5 or 10 minute video, learn how to do it just after the task is listed. If you already know how to do it, you can skip that video and move on to the next one. So it's our way of making things a little bit more efficient when it comes to learning, and you just get the knowledge that you need instead of having to be taught over and over what you already know. So go ahead and get that started, and if you want a tip on the quizzes, the answers to those are a lot of times going to be, of course, in the book, but also in the slide presentation. So look for that when you go to your open book quizzes. So that'll do it for Module 1. We'll see you in Module 2.